Now, I'd like to welcome you to the Beachwood Branch of Cuyahoga County Public Library. We're very glad that you're here for tonight's special author event. For your convenience, I want to let you know that our restrooms are down the hall to your right. In the unlikely event of an emergency, we have an emergency exit also to your right. We have books available for purchase this evening, courtesy of Max Bax Books and the author, who will be available to sign them immediately afterwards if you like. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your mobile devices. Thank you. Don Iannone is the author of 10 books of poetry, 10 photography books, and 5 nonfiction books. He has worked in economic development and public policy for over 4 decades. Don holds a doctorate in philosophy and teaches graduate business courses at Transcontinental University. He and his wife, Mary, who's here tonight, reside in Chagrin Falls, very close to Beachwood here. Don's here tonight to talk about his latest nonfiction book, which is called America's Dream at the Crossroads, the 2024 Election and Beyond. In addition, we have John Ettore, a local veteran writer and journalist who is also here tonight. He will be interviewing Don after his initial presentation. Please welcome Don Iannone.
Much appreciated. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to add to that John and I go a long way back. We actually were part of the first group of bloggers in town. That's when you had Jack Prosciutto, you had George Nemeth, you had John, myself, Ed Morrison. Who am I forgetting?
Oh, there were so many.
There were a number.
Too many of them.
Not many of them survived. You survived. You survived as a blogger. Yeah. But John has written widely for publications all over the country, including our major newspapers and Press International. You've written for Cleveland Magazine and a number of other, on a wide variety of issues. But I thought it would be a really good experience for John and I to kind of interact after I share a little bit about the book. And then we're going to open up to all of you, and hopefully you came with some hard questions tonight. So I'll try to field them all. Sometimes I might duck a little bit, but I think that'll be okay. I have some slides, and I'm not going to be overly disciplined about them. And I'll tell you this, if you provide me with your email address, I will also be sure to send you the slides, okay? Fair enough? So, I've already done that. Let's do a quick go around. I'd like to make sure everybody at least has somebody's name. Jay, let's start with you.
Jay Miller. I've been a reporter for a long time, most recently Crane's Cleveland Business.
I'm Ellen Connolly, retired judge of the Cleveland Business Report and former president of Cleveland County Council.
Michael Ettore.
Julie Ettore.
Jan Tucker.
Jan.
Jennifer Dillinger.
John Dillinger.
John Dillinger? You look great for your age.
Ann Murphy.
Brian Casey.
Chris Ticknor.
Mary Iannone.
Thank you. Now there will be a quiz afterwards. Don't ask me. I can probably name about 3 or 4 of you already, but not all of you. So anyway, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to try to keep my remarks short. I think the interview will kind of spark the discussion. And, you know, I think it's important in something like this that people really feel like they're welcome to jump in and not only ask questions, but provide perspective on what's being said. Am I within the camera view, Mary?
Now you are.
So, the major takeaways from the book itself is that I think the American dream, which has been with us from early colonial times, and it's morphed into many different forms over the years, really constitutes what I would say is a guidepost in trying to understand not only this election, but where we are as a society and all the things that we hope to achieve. So what is the American dream about? It's about economic and social mobility. And there's a lot of different ways to look at that, and I provide some evidence on how well we're doing as a nation and how various states are doing in terms of achieving the American dream, at least in economic achievement terms. Here's something that might surprise you. When you look at all the states and you look at real per capita personal income in 2017 terms, and you look at the cost of living, and you use that as a way to basically put it into perspective, what's your real buying power. Top state, anybody want to venture a guess? Which state comes out number one, where your dollar goes further than actually your real income?
Ohio.
Any other guesses? North Dakota, then South Dakota, and it's really interesting because the red states come out better than the blue states in that regard, and that's because a lot of them have less populated areas and a lot of other factors in terms of demographics that I think account for that. But it's interesting so I've been, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but it's been interesting the kind of questions you get when you talk to people around the country about a book. They don't want to know about Ohio. If you're talking to people in California, I want to know about California. Or, my family has moved out of California because they can't afford to live here, can't buy a house. And so 10 years ago, they moved to Montana, which now is too expensive, right? Because everybody's moved there. But it's interesting the different takes that you get. And I'm going to share some of those insights, and I've kind of summarized some of that because I think that's all the new stuff about the book and what I've been talking about. But our nation faces a lot of critical issues. Most of those have been pretty well reported out in the news media for a very long period of time. But I think when we think about them, we need to think in a more integrated way. And that's why I use the American dream as a way to really think about it, as opposed to saying, well, we're doing okay, in this area in terms of our buying power. Inflation is now down, which it is for now anyway. But I think it's important to really have an integrated perspective. So when I think about those issues, and the book really deals with them in an integrated way, and the recommendations that I make really try to get the two candidates for president and then all of us to begin to think about this in a much more integrated fashion. The other point the book makes is that everything that government does has an impact on the American dream. Too often we think that this has to do with housing and urban development, or the Department of Commerce, or it has to do with the Labor Department, or it has to do with our tax policies. It's everything. And I teach systems approach to business. That's what I was really hired to do at Transcontinental University. And it's probably the most difficult thing to do in the world because everybody wants to be a specialist. Everybody wants to be in finance or marketing, or they want to be in operations or distribution, communications. But the reality is we need a systems approach. And that takes a lot of patience. And that makes some of the things that I say in the book in terms of recommendations, they seem improbable because nobody has the appetite for that much change. But I think we really need to look at things in that frame. And I think this election is an opportunity to do that. And I think that the other side of it is, as we think about what's the fundamental thing that I think is wrong. And I think we really need to fix government itself. I think we really need to fix how government operates. And this is not just a conservative perspective, but I don't think it's working. And I think the way in which we see, the name calling that goes on, the inability of the legislature and the executive branch and others to even talk to each other. I mean, to run things out to the very last minute and then spend a lot of money and take what was a $35 trillion debt to $36 trillion doesn't make any sense to me. So those are the main takeaways when you think about the book itself. And I will go through the highlights of the plan itself, which I categorize into four different buckets, if you will. So the book says we need political process reform. These are things that many people have been saying for many years, that we need campaign finance reform, we want to curtail special interest lobbying. There's been a lot of talk about a real third party, which we've not really had since Ross Perot. And, really to put an end to celebrity politics, and I take that position that I think we honestly need to know the qualifications of people who run for office, not just the presidency, but everybody. And we spend too much time getting tied up and identifying with, the things that have to do with what they say and what gets reported in the news, but we really don't understand their qualifications. And I think the second thing is we need government reform in terms of not just waste reduction, but innovation. You know, back in the late 80s, there was quite a push on trying to get the states to innovate with new ways to really build things and make them work. And one of the things that we have lost over the years is our intergovernmental system. You know, it's a free-for-all. There is no working together. I think states and local governments do a better job of working together than states and the federal government. We had, at one time, an amazing intergovernmental system. We don't have that anymore. People talk about public-private partnerships or private-public partnerships, that is ways in which to get business and government to work together, and the not-for-profit sector and philanthropy. But honestly, we've got a long way to go in making that happen. I remember when privatization and private contract operation of government functions like wastewater treatment plants and things. Steve Goldsmith was the mayor of Indianapolis, and I actually had the opportunity to work with him on some experiments to really look at how can we do that? How can we actually involve the private sector in the contract management of some of these functions, not only save money, but to basically provide a better service. And I think we need to go back to that. And we need to learn how to work together to make things work. My book is dedicated to George Voinovich, a guy who I consider to be a friend, a man I respected as a public servant, a man who taught me a great deal, and I think influenced my own way of thinking about government as public service. And I could think of no better person to get dedicated to. And there's a lot of wonderful people in the world. But, you know, it was my experience in working for him on a lot of different levels that really showed me that, you know, public-private partnerships can work. I talk about this in the book. People say, well, Don, how are you going to fix these problems? You know, you've got all these great ideas. What I liked about George Voinovich was he did Operations Improvement Task Force, both and Jay, you remember this, and John, I know you do too, and Ellen, I'm sure you do. But it's really been so long since we've taken that kind of tact, where we bring together the resources in this first 90 days and we look at how we're going to make government work again. All of us want to be policy wonks. And I got to tell you, I got caught up in that in my time at Cleveland State. I loved it. I loved the whole idea of doing policy analysis. But you know something? What I learned from George Voinovich was you have to make government work. And so I think we need to do that. We need to do that in Washington, and I think we need to encourage that in state government, and we need to do that in local government again. But what's happened, you know, today people say, well, the economy is terrible. You know, we inherited this terrible economy from Donald Trump. Donald Trump says, you know, I inherited this economy. The economy has a life of its own. It is influenced, it has a history. You know, it has patterns. Policies have been in place for years that influence, you know, when you step into office. And so I think we need to recognize that, as opposed to saying, well, let's look at what the inflation rate is. Well, no, let's actually do an analysis of what's happened to inflation over the last quarter century. Let's look at that, as opposed to just, you know, looking at what happens in presidential terms or gubernatorial terms or wherever we want to look at. But I think that that's important. I think that we really have looked at domestic affairs and international and foreign affairs in a very fragmented and isolated way. You know, we have to be able to see the relationship between what happens to our nation at home and the rest of the world. We have to protect our interests, but at the same time, I think we have to be aware, and I just wrote a paper that so far nobody's paid attention to, but that's not so unusual, right? That talks about the importance of international trade to the Ohio and the Northeast Ohio economy. And what would happen under, at least what we know, the two sets of policy ideas by Vice President Harris and former President Donald Trump. And neither one of them really provide a very competitive framework. All I can tell you is international trade is very important. There's a thing in economics that's called comparative advantage, and you shouldn't be producing things that you can buy in higher quality and more inexpensively abroad. because what happens is the consumer suffers. But at the same time, we live in very dangerous times in terms of the economy. And when we really look closely at the way that China in particular approaches the economy, I mean, there's no stopping it. There's no end to it because it's a government financed and backed economy. We still have, for the most part, a market-driven economy. But government plays a tremendous role in what we do, and we need to recognize that. So when we say cutting the budget, you asked me that question. How do you do that? Well, it's whose part of the budget do you want to cut, Don? You know, not mine in education, or not mine if you're looking at environmental protection, or if you're looking at, you know, the tax policies that affect businesses. Well, we don't want to impose any greater burden there. But the reality is that we really have been living a dream that has become more of a nightmare. That quite honestly, it's a very unstable situation as I look at it. I've gotten a lot of flack because I said in the book that we are on the brink of a systemic collapse of our governmental and political system. People say, well, that's Chicken Little, right? Or it's, you know, the sky's falling and, you know, this is just a bunch of crazy talk. You know, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. I don't think it is. And I'm not a pessimist, but I think we honestly need to take stock of what we've been doing. We need to be aware that everything that government does either helps or hinders the ability of Americans to attain the American dream in their own way. Everything. Everything it does. So rebuilding the American dream through the things I talked about earlier, I think is critical. And I'm going to quickly go through these lessons, and John, you'll have to beat me up about some of these. But after 42 interviews, first of all, people get tired of you saying the same thing. So honestly, they're looking for something new. And so I learned a lot in the kind of questions and the way that I fumbled around trying to answer their questions, in some cases successfully, in some cases not. But, you know, this whole idea that it's either or, when we think about our two choices for president and everything else in politics, it's the binary thinking. It's either this or it's that. So what do we lose in that? Well, first of all, it oversimplifies really complex issues and policies and ignores what would be the nuances of either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris's policies, right? There's so much we don't know. And there's so much to be determined based upon how either candidates decide to execute those policies. And what happens when you got to tangle with Congress, and when you got to deal with the states, and you got to deal with all these chits that, you know, you got to basically do the dance. You know, if I put $200 million in your campaign, I'm sorry, that's not free money. I want something back. And it polarizes voters, reducing what I would call a meaningful dialogue. So that's what this binary thing does. Some people say, well, what do you want to do? Introduce a third candidate in there? Maybe. But maybe we need to think beyond this. Our choices are not just one or the other. And I don't think we should live our lives that way. You know, Mary and I spent 7 years working with cancer patients and their family at the Cleveland Clinic. We do it 2 days a week. We learned so much. You know, one thing we learned? Most people don't think about is life and death. It does hit them, but there's a whole set of other things that open up. And if they live long enough, they begin to see what life is made of and how they need to make the most of it, and how they can't let cancer be everything in their life. I'm a cancer survivor, by the way. So it is very scary. But I think that, you know, it's not either or. And I think that, you know, we really need to look more at, you know, everything else that we see beyond just this set of choices. Liberal and conservative media creates and reflects America's binary thinking. And it does that through confirmation bias, through polarization, and misinformation. You know, I don't really care what you read, what you watch. It really doesn't matter. I mean, it's all the same thing. The main thing is, and I tell my students this, is they just need to think for themselves, because that's what they have to live with, as opposed to being spoon-fed. We don't spoon-feed our students, we really don't, and I think that's a good thing. So what I learned in terms of the 4 worst fears of Americans are these 4 things. Economic instability is seen in terms of inflation, jobs, financial security. Secondly, political division, which we've seen a lot of, but it's really the biggest fear that I hear about is social unrest. People are worried this whole thing is going to blow up. They really are worried about that. And democracy's future, which I think we understand it in a different way if you're viewing it from the right or the left, but there's a concern about democracy. And it's not just democracy, it's not just freedom. We live in a republic. That's the reality. And there's a lot of concern about that. And then I think the loss of personal freedom, fears about restrictions on individual rights and lifestyle choices, you know, all along the continuum is an issue. And I heard a lot about that, especially when you talk to people in California. A lot. 4 interviews there, and I learned a lot from that. So what do I hear people saying about the 2 candidates in terms of their vision of the American dream? So they talk about Kamala Harris, they talk about equality in terms of expanding opportunities for the middle class and for marginalized groups, social justice, prioritizing fairness in healthcare, education, housing, progressive policies that have to do with the environment, foreign policy, tech innovation. And when you look at Donald Trump, it's economic growth, it's deregulation, it's tax cuts that, in my view, I think largely benefit. I'm not a fan of trickle-down economics, so we can argue if you want to, but I'm not. But I think that there's a lot of good to that. I think there's a role for deregulation. I think if we do things right, we could open up a lot of industries and create a lot of efficiencies. I think when we think about Donald Trump, it's national security, it's strong borders, certainly is America first. I heard this time and time again. And traditional values, emphasis on individualism, conservative, the family. And so those things really stood out. You know, when I look across the whole set of interviews I've done, those are things that really stood out. What do I do right now? I'm doing what I'm doing here tonight is really trying to engage others about the book and mostly the ideas in the book, and continuing to do that, and spending a lot of time here, because this is my background, economic development, which in my mind has always played a huge role in helping communities, businesses, individuals, and families pursue and achieve the American dream. I never knew that in all those years. I never put it that way, but I think probably economic development is very much that. And there's a lot of things that are not right with economic development. If you read any of my recent stuff about public financing of sports stadiums, you know, it's just like some of this stuff doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I think writing more, I mentioned the trade piece and other things are things that I plan to do and they'll be out there. But one of the things I find is the attention economy is a tough one, just in terms of trying to get attention for your ideas. It's not easy. It's not easy. So that's what I have to say. John.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions for Don, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. But I thought I'd just set the stage by talking about, Don introduced himself, but he didn't tell you about some of the most interesting things that I find about him. I've known him personally for 20 years, going on 20 years, but I've known of him professionally for closer to 40. And because he's been working in economic development, it's easy to assume that his PhD's in economics. It's actually in philosophy. And the other thing he didn't mention, he's a pretty accomplished poet. If you, I think it's Poet Alchemy?
Poet alchemist.
And if you forget that, you can Google his name and poetry, and he's got reams of poetry, dozens, hundreds probably of poetry.
I love poetry.
So I think that explains why he attacks this book in ways to me that are really interesting. And he does 3 things I think really well that I noticed. One is he finds some statistics and numbers and data that are surprising, and it's hard to surprise me because I read everything. But he found a stat that really took my breath away. Everybody knows that the top 1% captures a ridiculous amount of wealth in America. It's 30%. What I didn't know is they also pay, the top 1% of Americans in income pay 45% of taxes, income taxes, almost half. And that goes, kind of flies in the face of what you read about wealthy people evading taxes. So, but he uses these details in ways that I think really set the argument well. And then he has some, what I think is kind of fresh, thoughtful framing of looking at the issues differently. And let me just read this brief out from the book. It's near the conclusion. Quote, "The American dream itself, premised on the ideals of liberty and prosperity, can no longer be pursued solely within the geographical confines of the United States. It requires a broad view that embraces intelligent foreign policies, thoughtful immigration strategies, and a leadership style that's adaptable and forward-thinking." And I thought that was interesting because the American dream, by definition, you think of as just about America, but he's talking about how it's really about how we intersect with the world. And then the poet in him, it's hard to get through a book that's not well read, that's not well written. And there's there are probably 10 or 12 places where I thought, wow, this is beautiful writing. So let me read this paragraph that took.
And John is a good writer, by the way. He really is.
And this is quote, I'm quoting from him. "In an era where a startup in Silicon Valley can outsource programming to Bangalore, or a homeowner in the Midwest might rely on solar panels manufactured in China, understanding the fabric of international relations is not merely academic, it's essential for the economic literacy of every American voter. The implications for the American dream are clear. It is no longer sufficient to dream within the borders of a map. The new dream is a passport to a world of opportunity navigated by the understanding of international waters." That's just good writing, and it really just draws you into what otherwise could be really dense and just filled with a lot of details. So I guess my first question, I wanted to kind of throw a firecracker under your seat and maybe challenge one of the main premises of the book. You talk about, you have some interesting details here, but everybody kind of knows that the American dream's been set on this idea that each generation does better economically than the last. And he talks about, quotes the Pew Trust and Brookings Institution, that in the 40s, about 90% of generations earn more than their parents. By the 60s, that was 70%. Now only about half of generations are higher incomes than their parents. I think, I've always had the feeling that what we think of as normal about the economy is tied to a very abnormal period, which is the immediate post-war world, kind of 1948 to 1973, which is when America started kind of plateauing a little bit economically. Yeah. But because the rest of the world was so devastated by World War II, by 1960, America's share of global GDP was 40%. Mm-hmm. Today it's about 15%. Mm-hmm. So isn't the whole... America's share of global GDP, the output of the economy, was 40% the entire world in 1960. Today it's 15%. So today what I think is we've kind of reverted to a norm in a way. So isn't the American dream kind of built on an abnormal period of prosperity in the United States?
Well, I think the thing that I learned, and I've really started looking at the American dream in the context of American literature, which many writers have talked about the dream during their time of writing. But I think it's really varied. I think the concept of upward mobility and doing better than your parents has been a part of that from really day one. But you look at what was the motivation. So the colonial era, it was really about people came here for religious freedom and for land and other resources and opportunity, and to escape what they saw as a very repressive, set of rules in England at the time. And so people built wealth then through agriculture, through land ownership, and eventually other businesses and industries grew up around that. It wasn't until really the Industrial Revolution that we saw, the wealth base broaden. But we were talking in that era about a rural America. Really, it was rural, with the exception of a few cities on the East Coast. But I think John makes a very important point that things really have changed. And Mary and I have talked a lot about my two sons, Jeff and Jason, their ability to succeed, and then we say, well, they're okay. but we worry about our grandkids, in terms of what's the available opportunities for them. But it's a whole different thing. If you look at LinkedIn and how people see work and jobs, it's very different, very different. Most of us probably stayed in the jobs that we had for a longer period of time. I don't think we should be critical of the generation now that they actually are much more mobile, because I think they have to be. But the economy has been disrupted at a more frequent rate than what we faced in let's say our generation itself. Disruptive technologies, obviously the interstate highway system was huge in terms of, catapulting the country, distribution, and everything else. It had same or even a greater impact than the railroads did going back into the 19th century. But I think today, the whole concept, Bruce and Ellen, I interviewed some people that really are going through this whole thing. They graduated from Ohio State now 4 years ago, and basically both got good jobs as teachers and engineers. They came out debt-wise okay, about $150,000, $160,000 between the two of them. You say, well, that's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But for them, basically the vision of owning a home is probably at least 5 years away. They're not going to do that now, and they can't. They cannot put the capital together to do that. And so that part of the dream, I think, has changed. But the other thing that I learned about the American dream was that urban areas and rural areas see it very differently. Home ownership is still very much a reality in rural America and small towns. If you go to Chicago, if you go to New York City, go to San Francisco, if you live in the city, it's much less the case, because it's just not a reality. You're there for different reasons. But I was glad I talked to a lot of rural and small town radio stations, because reality really hit in that. And people are very concerned about their rootedness, the loss of family and generations, their sense of place. But I think it's a different deal.
And you make the point that the American dream is a little different now, and that it's less about pure economics and more about equality, income, lessening income inequality and sustainability.
Yes, I really had to work hard on that, because the worst thing in the world you want to come out against is prosperity and wealth being for anybody. I think that's a mistake to do that. And so I started talking about this more in the context of prosperity plus well-being in a larger sense. And that seemed to appeal to a lot of people, because the recognition that healthcare and all the other services that we need to sustain, as education, that are really fundamentally important. And those things have a great deal to do with achieving the American dream. But as we all know, social capital has become so important, not just on social media, but social capital is really something that I don't think we gave nearly enough recognition to for many years. We talked about financial and economic capital.
Why don't you explain what social capital?
Well, social capital has to do with relationships, and that's the fundamental thing, that how we relate, the kinds of relationships that we form. And I think the kind of society, the kind of communities first that grow up around that. And what's tested us is obviously the impact of the internet and now remote work and all these things that really have become pretty profound realities in terms of what are our relationships? How do we relate? Is a virtual relationship as healthy as, does it bring the same degree of well-being as an in-person relationship? But it's a different deal.
You mentioned Bowling Alone, which is this famous book about how those social ties and community ties are loosening and decreasing.
Yes, and that's even happening in rural America, and it's happening in small towns. I was very careful in the book to make sure I provided good coverage. It wasn't just a book about the American dream in urban America, urban states. But I looked at it from the level of the national level down to the state level, to regions. I looked at communities. I deliberately looked at the diversity of this America that we have. Because that's the thing. And so diversity is a beautiful thing, but it's hard to manage, and it's hard to figure out how to figure all this out and how to make it work. That's what's tough. I don't think we need to go back and say that we're going to be just this. But I think we just have to learn a new set of skills, and institutions, including education, needs to really figure out how we build that kind of social capital in the future.
Don, having read the book and knowing you a little, I think I know what motivated you to write the book, but could you talk about that a little bit?
I think probably Mary could answer this question better. I mean, Howard Mayer, how are you?
Oh, wow, no echo.
No, this guy goes way for,
Yeah.
oh, he's got a whole story, we'll let him tell later. But I wrote this book, and Mary will testify to this. I spent too much time ranting about things in politics as opposed to really trying to understand them. Probably some of you read things I posted on Facebook or other places. That's useless. It's useless, I'm sorry. And so Mary said, well, how much time are you going to put into this thing? I said, however long it takes. And you know, there's one reason why Mary's name appears in the credits for every book I've ever written. It's because she has supported me. There's been a sacrifice on her part, things that we could have done, that frankly, she said, I know this is important. That's going to be important to other people. But I lost track of what I was saying.
Why you chose to
I wrote this book because I needed to do something.
Yeah.
And I needed to do it. I needed to do it without taking sides. You know, and that was the toughest thing was, you know, we're all, you know, taking sides on these issues, or the binary thing. We're just so conditioned to do it. But I learned so much by not taking sides.
Well, that's a great.
And yet not abandoning my own values.
That's
okay?
a great lead in to something I wanted to needle you about. There's a movement in journalism that's been called Sane washing, S-A-N-E washing, which is the idea that rather than whitewashing, you're trying to make something insane look a little saner. And 3 guesses what the context is. It's usually about Trump. That the New York Times will take some word salad that he says at a rally and dress it up so that it sounds normal. Did you struggle with that? I want to read just one very brief thing. You talk about Trump's approach to Mexico, focused on border security and immigration.
Okay.
His administration implemented policies such as migrant protection protocols. What most people think of as his view about Mexico is about how they're opening their prisons and letting all the rapists in. I mean, so in that would, to me, was an example of where you made him sound a little more mainstream than he was. Did you struggle with that, given that you wanted to come down in the middle and not make it about partisanship?
Yes. But I also struggled on the other side, on really the Democratic side and all the candidates that we've known there too. So it's hard to be fair in your writing. And, you know, I should say it's really hard. And some people write books that are very opinionated. And probably there would be more people buying my book if it was an opinionated book, but it's not. It's really because I think the issues matter. I think the American dream is a great place to synthesize so many things. Howard, you've lived and worked in so many communities. Nathan Grunstein, he has his name in this book, by the way. Yeah. One of Howard's teachers.
Don was my best student ever.
So my first political science course was taken with Howard Mayer at Cleveland State University in 1973. Yeah. We talk and laugh about that a lot. 1973 was a long time ago.
This is reminding me when I ran into a lady that I once babysat for, and she told me she was a grandmother. That was a moment when I realized the numbers were pretty daunting. My last question, and then we'll open up to the floor. If you were to hope that your readers took away just one big notion from reading this book, what would that be?
It certainly would be for all of us to keep our mind open, to learn to think more critically about issues, and don't get sucked into the bitterness. Don't lose sight of the fact that this really is a great country, that it really is. I'm sorry. you know, all the things that we look at. But those are the things that I would hope the reader would grasp, and that, you know, going through 6 edits was not easy because a lot of stuff I wrote. The first, nobody wants to read that. Mary read it. It was a lot of ranting, okay? Blaming government as opposed to saying government is really an important institution in society and it must work for society to work. It must work.
All right. Any questions?
I'll
Okay.
start with one.
Go.
You talked earlier about, actually, John, you said it, the idea that our kids are not matching the success that we had. Usually, you're 1973, I think you mentioned.
Right, that's the oil shock.
But yet, people are living longer. Isn't that a success?
Well, I think that goes to Don's point about how we're redefining what it means, the American dream, that part of it is well-being.
Yeah,
Right.
well-being, quality of life, you know.
So Europe, for instance, the EU is lagging behind China and America strictly economically. Do they have a higher quality of life? I would say so if you've been there.
A lot of these surveys say they do.
Yeah.
But I think that, I think it's good, but it's really a tough one for us to manage. And, you know, we know a lot of people, and again, through our work with cancer patients who were basically wiped out financially, wiped out. And they never thought that they would have to face this. On Medicare, Medicaid, they're on Medicaid. And so the longer we live, we're ill-equipped to deal with that. But it's a struggle. I mean, everything is just in terms of social capital, social support systems, and everything. I'm glad we are living longer. I know I don't want to live too long so that, you know, I'm in such terrible shape that...
You mentioned one of your points deep in the book is about rethinking, trying to encourage more private savings, retirement savings, not depending as much on Social Security.
Well, I think we do need to open up new possibilities. That's a tax law question, right, in terms of how we treat it. So that's basically what it is. But I think it's really essential that we, and you know, I have to tell you that when I look at my students and I look at other young people, a lot of us say, well, they're not really planning for the future. I got to tell you, I see some of the best thinking about the stock market coming from young people I see anywhere. I mean that. But I think it's really important that we create the kind of mechanisms that are needed. But you know, we can't look to government for everything. I mentioned before the number $36 trillion. You know, people say, well, how are you going to fix the federal debt? We can't spend what we're spending anymore, and I don't care who gets elected, you can't. There is a day of reckoning that's going to hit. You know, you can't keep pushing this thing out.
Yeah.
And I think it's
the Browns
just,
and the Deshaun Watson contract. Right? So, any other questions? Anybody?
So what do you think?
Well,
What is it? Yeah, there's a question back here.
You're talking about the different philosophies of right or left or whatever, but you have to frame it with the personalities. Do we have a sane person that can perform this? And that's so key that I don't know that reaches up into that diagram that you have up there, the sanity of the people that are trying to run this, or the lack of sanity.
Yeah. So I do agree with you. And so the book has a section that really looks, and because President Biden was the candidate at the time the book came out, it really sizes him up from a character standpoint and looks at his personality. Talk a lot about public persona, the face we wear in public. I do the same with Donald Trump. But I did with fairness. That's what John was poking at, is because, you know, it's easy to say you don't like somebody, right? And so you say, well, we're going to character assassinate them. I bit my tongue a lot on that. But do I think character is important and values? I absolutely do. And I think that we need to have confidence in whoever sits in the White House as a human being. So.
Howard, do you have a question?
Yeah, where did you get most of your economic data? And I always get the impression that one analyst could pick gross domestic product, another answer could unemployment, all kinds of data out there
Yes.
to measure the economy. How did you go about doing
So
that?
I used the standard sources. Most of them are the, whether it's Bureau of Economic Analysis, it's Bureau of Labor Statistics. What I tried to avoid, and there's still some of that in there because I quote, there's a lot of references in the book, but I try to stay away from a lot of the processed views of things. Because if you were to look at the Economic Policy Institute, you know what they're going to say about, working America. They're gonna, have that whole view that, that things are not so good. And if you look at, let's say the American Enterprise Institute on the other side, they're gonna have a certain view. I did look and I read the five most recent books about the American dream. And I thought all of them had different answers. What's his name from the New York Times? Leonard.
David Leonard.
He basically says we need to rebuild, the middle class, the working class, and unions. I mean, that's what he said. The guy who wrote the book from the American Enterprise Institute was basically saying everything's fine. There's no crisis here. Everything's absolutely fine. People are getting ahead. And we shouldn't be standing in their way by, saying that the house is falling apart. So they're very different views of things. But I tried to go to the standard sources that everybody would use. I did. I had an editor, and Lisa forbade me to put a bunch of data tables in there. She says, you're allowed, write 3 tables. Use the information, cite it, but nobody is going to look at these stupid graphs that you put in there because they're not going to understand. And so they're gone. They were in there in an earlier version, Howard.
I read all that stuff.
I know that's because you've got this amazing mind, and as you're training, and you did that for years. I'm glad that you did. But I think, I talk some about evidence-based public policy. This is the whole idea that we need some kind of a research foundation. We really need to understand, what we can about the intended and the unintended consequences of policies. But we all know we don't know any of this stuff until we start trying to execute it. I remember my experience with the Water Quality Management Plan when I worked at NOACA and where that started. And I remember almost getting killed out in Cuyahoga County because my job was to help Cuyahoga County prepare a septic tank management plan, and there were 500 people at the Middlefield Town Hall waiting on me. And Terry Hall, the health commissioner, basically had to make sure I was protected.
They ran him out of town.
They did. They ran him out of town. But we don't know what any of this stuff means until we start putting it into place. I mean, we really don't. That's why I go back to the Voinovich thing of making government operate. He's the best example I can think of, really, somebody who really wanted government to work. And he had respect for taxpayers and their money, and I respected him for that. I really did.
Well, let me throw a question there, because obviously you harken back to him, and you also mentioned, what's his name from Arizona, John McCain.
John McCain.
And those are obviously 2 exemplars of centrist,
Yes.
smart Republicans. Isn't that Republican Party pretty much dead now?
Oh God, I hope not. I belong to that part of the party. I confess right at the beginning, this book is written from a moderate, now I'm beginning to stumble a little bit, from a moderate conservative perspective, because that's where I've been most of my life. I mean, I take other issues, I look at things with an open mind, but I respected, both of those elected officials for who they were. And the other thing is that, this is really funny. Mary's heard me say this a million times. Probably the Republicans need me more than the Democrats do. There are a lot of Democrats that could do the same kind of stuff I could do. I'll be very honest with you. And I'm all about trying to take the party back, if you want to know where I stand. That I think more of us need to jump into that that can and try to sort it out from that perspective, as opposed to those two extremes, the binary stuff. That's personal.
Okay. Any other questions? Sir?
Hi.
Out of 350 million people who live in America, why can't we find candidates that everybody likes?
If I said that was the $1 million question, that would be understating it. And I've been asked that so many times. I go back to actually high school civics, and I remember that set an impression in my mind that really this was an important job and it needed to be taken seriously, and it wasn't just something that people did. I mean, even though for a lot of my education it was the great man theory of leadership, that, you know, Eisenhower was this great person, and so we kind of used those examples to kind of judge people and their qualifications. But I think the real lesson is that all of us need to assume a higher level of responsibility for our civility, what we do. And I think we also need to make sure that we really put forward candidates that matter, whether they win or lose. But until we tackle this whole issue of special interest lobbying and the amount of money that gets thrown into advertising by the two parties, it's pretty hard to get attention. It's pretty hard. But we can't give up on this. We cannot. We cannot.
Well, I think it's very hard being a candidate now. I mean, John Kennedy could not have gotten elected, because he was a womanizer. But now, I mean, you run for office and somebody goes back and finds the entry that you put on your, in junior high schools, your yearbook or something, it says like, you said something. So it's very tough being a candidate, because everything that you ever did in your life is now open. And, I've been elected official, and you're kind of walking in the supermarket buying some milk and somebody's yelling at you. And, you're like, do I really need this agriculture? So, and then, in Ohio, put these term limits in. And so the legislature, the only people in the legislature who have any knowledge of the lobbyists. Because, you're always running for another seat. So, we used to have people that had been in the legislature together for long periods of time, able to work together and, and be friends, and that doesn't happen anymore. So it's tough. It's a different milieu being an elected official than it was. I mean, like in the 19th century, you go give the same speech over and over again, and everybody's fact checking every single word you say. Yep. So it's tough.
Absolutely right. You know that from experience, I know. So one thing that I admired about my boss at Cleveland State was David Sweet, who was the dean of the College of Urban Affairs. He started the awards program for public service. And I think he really saw that like Voinovich did, in the sense that this was really an important calling, that you didn't work in political businesses, you didn't work in government because you couldn't get a job in business. I remember somebody actually said that. I had a student who he said, after I finish my urban studies degree, I'm going to get a business degree because nobody will hire me, even though I love urban studies. And I said, don't do that. I said, get a business degree if you really want to round yourself out, but don't avoid the field you love, And so it is tough, and I think you're absolutely right, Ellen, that you are under great scrutiny.
You got to raise money all the time.
And people said to me, why didn't you ever run for office? And I said, I don't want to be in that glass house. I really don't.
In a recent debate, they brought up, I think Harris brought up the scenario where Trump called a bunch of Republican congressmen, I think, and told them not to vote for the border thing that they had agreed on. And that border agreement was a recent example of both sides getting together to try and, make progress on an important issue.
Yeah.
My uncle used to work for Congressman Murtha of Pennsylvania in the 70s and 80s, and he used to tell me great stories about them working with Tip O'Neill and other, back to the times when they used to work together, getting things done. From my perspective, and I come at it, I used to be more centrist. I've gravitated more progressive Democrat as I've gotten older, because since Newt Gingrich, I feel like the Republicans have been more obstructionist to getting things done than the Democrats have. And I feel like at this point, Democrats are the ones that, when they get in office, try to do stuff for the country. and the Republicans try to block it and obstruct it and then run on that. I don't know. I feel like that system is so broken right now. I don't know how to get it to.
Well, again, I think all of us have to just do what we can that's within our reach. It is really important that we don't give up on government as an institution and politics, because when we do that, I mean, we're going to see things even worse than what we see today or what we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
But I look back at my career, I had a lot of tough assignments. I worked for 5 federal agencies as a consultant. And the hardest thing, I'm going to tell it. So I was part of a team that was hired to do a regulatory impact analysis on President Obama's stream water protection rule, which was going to widen the impact in coal mining for both, underground and strip mining. And so we thought we were doing a pretty good job. We were asked to basically do a conceptual impact study, which meant we had to make a lot of assumptions and spend a lot of time building assumptions because the rule had not been well defined. That happens all the time, by the way. It's nothing new, but it was my first experience with it. And it was horrible. So we submitted a report, and they were ready to rip the contract up and make us redo the work, because they had had 9 months and they had advanced the definitions of this, which we said, well, okay, we will come back. But the whole thing got thrown out into the public. The Associated Press got a hold of this thing. And so all of a sudden, the congressional, I can't remember, the subcommittee in the House basically calls this hearing because, what is this? 7,000 jobs are going to be lost due to this new Obama rule. And that's the way the whole thing was pitched. And you know how we got out of it? This shows you where people do understand. People understand politics sometimes. There's a mining engineer in Kentucky, he'll go on a name. He had a tape recorder in his pocket, and our team was asked to compromise its scientific integrity by the Office of Surface Mining. He had it on record. But that stuff happens all the time. But I make that point because I think we need a more scientific approach. I think we need to be more evidence-based. Howard's question about what data to use, it makes all the difference in the world. Or whether you use any data at all, or whether it's just all conjecture. But to be honest with you, evidence-based public policy is not easy. But that's the direction we need to go. I actually think that artificial intelligence is going to help us do that. And I think the tools are emerging around that to make it happen. A lot of people are frightened by that, but I think that's coming. And I really do, and I think it's going to be a huge tool in us being really understanding the implications of things. But I think we're also going to see all kinds of craziness that we can't even imagine today. So, questions, other ones?
Have you, in your research, did you see anything with greed, how it relates to the American dream? And I'm just thinking about, 1% of the world are just doing really well, and or are getting poorer. But I also think of healthcare, the cost of healthcare. I also think of insurance companies just draining people. If their house goes up in smoke, that's all they own, and it's
Right.
gone because insurance companies won't
Right.
insure them properly. But it just seems like greed is getting in the way of people reaching the American dream. Did you find anything in the research?
Well, I think there are large parts of the American population that feel like they're not even close to achieving the American dream. And I think there's a long way to go there. And I don't think the answer is the same for everybody. It's not tax cuts. And it's not, it's a lot of things. So I'm going to tell you something I think is really important. I think education is a foundation for everything. Continuing education, not just what we get in our college years. So I was just asked to join the board of an organization that works on adult literacy here, Seeds for Literacy, which is a West Side organization. And I thought, wow, this is something I really believe in. I mean, if we don't solve that problem, and the statistics are staggering. I mean, I've heard that upwards of 60% of the city Cleveland population only he's at the 4th grade literacy level, low literacy. That hasn't been confirmed, but I think the numbers are really significant. I grew up, by the way, in a low literacy family. My mother, her whole side of the family, grew up in Appalachian Holler, right? So this was not a part of the American dream goal. Just getting a job, working forward. My dad's side of the family was different because he came from immigrant roots. His father came from Italy, worked on the railroads, steel mills, the coal mines, but it was different and they were educated. But I know what that's like, and I see what happens to people. And that's why education has been so important to me. Some of the greatest influences I ever had in my life were my teachers, like Howard. It's true.
Well, the teachers were my influence me.
I know.
They still do.
I know. It's a beautiful thing. I think that's part of it. I think when we really look at it, it's that. One thing that I don't think we're ever going to be without is pain in some form and discomfort. But we need to prepare people. We've got to do something. There can't be that many people that, basically are, that low on the literacy scale. We cannot have that. Because you don't even know how to vote. That's the kind of thing that, you work on is really, how do you vote? Anything else? I got 2 hands up here. I'll go as long as you will. The back first.
This could be very controversial, but what do you think of Project 225, or 2025?
So I've read several summaries, and I will confess that I probably allowed newspapers to tell me more about that than actually jumping into that massive document. I had somebody from a radio station in San Rafael, California, who said, a lot of your ideas in your book are the same thing as being said in Project 225. And some of those ideas are about cutting government and making sure that we clean up the mess. But I think it's just, I have to tell you what I've seen, it's so off the charts weird. It is just, this is not something we want to do.
I guess I'll voice my opinion. My fear is that we can't come back from something like that. Mm-hmm. Although our history, and NPR, I was driving somewhere, I listened, that in our history, we have had some very, very difficult times, and we have been able to come back.
Yeah.
But because times have changed, and people, I think, are influenced in different ways.
Yes.
My great fear is that maybe we can't come back from something like that. Or what would life be like if we can't? That's where my thoughts are going.
Well, I hope that we don't ever have to face the day where that's our policy agenda. I certainly hope not. But I don't think, I don't think most Republicans agree with that. I think you got the extreme side. A lot of them don't even know. That's the other thing is I wrote this book because I didn't have a very good understanding of the issues. And I learned a lot by writing the book. And like anybody who's prone to be a teacher, you decide that you really need to do something with what you've learned. But to be honest with you, it's tough to figure all this out. And I probably got, maybe 1 or 2% of it figured out. But it's important that we try to understand these things and that we don't just rely on what the news media tells us, that we read, we think, we talk to other people, we keep an open mind, we think critically. I think that is so, so important. But it's overwhelming. It is absolutely overwhelming to everybody. And so I read an article, I think it was initially posted on LinkedIn. It was about the fact that business now hopes to use mental health as a business metric. And I said, that's great. But when is healthcare insurance going to catch up with being able to pay for mental health? Because it isn't. That's where I think we come up with these things, and actually they sound pretty silly when you think about it. Do I think we should emphasize emotional intelligence and all these things and really see human beings and make sure that we take care of people in the workplace? We absolutely should. and mental health should be considered. But, you know, if the senior managers and executives are going to get paid by how many people no longer complain about their problems, we haven't solved that problem. And the other thing is that we really do need to figure out, healthcare insurance does a lousy job in that area. It really does. And I don't care what policy you look at. But it seems to me we need to do more there. Not everything we deal with is in our body. A lot of this has to do with our mind and spirit.
I just made a proposal a couple of days ago about requiring insurance companies to cover mental health. I don't know if that's.
Yeah.
One of the things that concerned me is, I mean, I know I'm kind of an elitist, but I went to see To Kill a Mockingbird, and it was a 40-ish white woman walking in front of me. She had no clue of what To Kill a Mockingbird was about. I mean, she never heard the story. She never saw the movie.
Yeah.
She had no idea. I'm a docent at the Soldier of Charles Monument. Another, I don't know, she was a 40-ish white woman. What side was Ohio in the Civil War?
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I was in court.
Yeah.
I had an Ohio State t-shirt on. What city is Ohio State in? And the bailiff started telling me, she's going to ask you about their t-shirt. So, I mean, to me, it's like cultural illiteracy.
Yeah.
It's very frightening. I mean, people who never read a book, or, you know.
So one of the interviews I had, somebody picked off that I have my undergraduate degree is in anthropology. This was it's a large economic development organization that was formed. It's called Golden Shovel, which means they're really into this whole thing about building and construction and all that kind of stuff. And so the woman that interviewed me, Bethany Quinn, she says, so tell me what you learned from your anthropology degree. And I didn't know how to answer. And I went, culture, and that things evolve. And then after I got those words out, I said, actually that's it. That there is a culture, and that we all exist within it. And that it's not any small matter, and that we learn to understand things in their cultural context as opposed to trying to superimpose our culture context on theirs. And she says, that's what I was hoping you'd say. And I said, well, thank you. I said, that's the only time anybody's ever asked me, why did you get an anthropology degree? It's because I loved it. Yes, sir. And then Howard.
I was just thinking about AI and literacy, and how AI is really going to take the cognitive load off of students to be literate and learn the kind of history and everything that our generations have done over the years. And so that's going to almost make it like a moot point at a certain point.
Yeah.
Until the further ahead, when AI can be implanted into the brain, and then everyone will be geniuses.
Give me some of that. Yeah. But you raise a really important question. I've wondered that myself. Are we really going to be handicapping our cognitive abilities by relying too much on that? But I mean, we've moved, I think, pretty gracefully to computers and the internet and other technology. But is there a threat around the AI thing? I think there is. I just happen to be more of an advocate for it. I really think that we need to do what we can to bring it into play in the right ways and with the right ethics. But I think it could be an incredible tool, for example, in tutoring, students on literacy. I mean, talk about personalized education. That's not a substitute for what we're doing in this room right now. Being together, actually sensing other human beings and all the things that are tied into that. But, it's going to be very interesting. My sons and my grandsons will probably know a lot more about this than I do. Howard, and then the back.
You might have talked about immigration before I got here, but...
We did.
You did, okay. So, at one time, Republicans basically said, as long as it's legal immigration, it's okay, but illegal immigration is no good. It seems to have morphed into something that all immigration is this bad, based on what I saw in the debate the other night, at least according to Trump. And then I don't think that the Democrats have much of a position at all on immigration. Yet, if you have a book on the American dream,
Yeah.
I mean, people immigrate because they believe in the American dream.
Yes.
They don't know what it is, but they want it. and yet, you know, to me, here's my statement on it, I guess. Let them in. Make them tax-paying citizens. They will make their way. And, you know, immigrants of all kinds seem to be vilified. And it's a sad story as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I agree. And my grandfather did come here in 1904 for that very thing called the American Dream. He was 15 years old, came from Italy. And I think he found it. And I think
You're the epitome of it.
my dad did,
Succeeded.
I did. And so I will confess that I'm a globalist. You know, I really think that that's how I tend to look at the world and people. And I understand it more from that standpoint. And I think mobility is incredibly important. And so the numbers that I've seen on immigration are, there are not that many tax cheats. There are not that many people that are doing all the things. They're just not. The data's there. I mean, you know, we've got some pretty good analysis that have been done, not by IRS, but by other agencies. Yeah.
Pay attention.
Yes.
Pay attention to the immigration. There's a immigration thing that happens again in January. Every January, and you go down to the Nagali Desert and learn about these immigrants, and you learn their stories. And, you know, they're not coming in there to rape and kill and do all that. They're such wonderful, caring, trying to make their life better people. There's a program that you should really pay attention to, and everybody here could join in to do that in January again. The people that work it are, they're so totally dedicated to the survival of these people, getting them across the border and setting them up and finding a place for them. We can't listen to this thing about they're rapists and killers. These people are fabulous. And we have to get involved. And I would have information, I can get you information on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a name of
Absolutely.
the program?
So,
It is. Let me think of it, because we're just about to have a program in Chagrin at Federated, and to show people how this works and have them experienced going through, you know, the experience of what it's like for them, so you can understand. But I don't find it.
I'll get you some paper afterwards. You can write it down, and we'll see that people get it. How's that? All right, our MAC representative.
Yeah, sorry.
Maxwell.
I don't normally speak up from behind my table, but I just felt like I wanted to put in 2 cents on this. I work part-time at Maxmax, but my day job is as a paralegal in an immigration firm. So I spend 40 hours a week working in immigration law, and I've been there about 2 years now. And something I just noticed is an intrinsic bias. And as you're talking about the duality, how people tend to be very polarized when it comes to issues. Something I hear people say is legal and illegal immigration. Like they're 2 completely different things. When most illegal immigration is people coming in legally and losing status, whether that's on purpose or an accident, they were trying to do it the right way and they lost it. People who are trying to regain status, people who do have access by parole in place program that's on hold because of the lawsuit right now, is for people who do have the right to have a green card. Being married to a U.S. citizen forgives your immigration sins, but the actual process for going to get one is so risky because of the penalties you could face before you're able to have the interview. It's so convoluted that people don't know what legal is and what illegal is. And I think that falling into that binary, well, as long as it's legal, it's okay. It's very dangerous and very untrue to many people's experience.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow. Glad you spoke up on that one. So let's see. Jay, was your hand up next?
Well, I have a very specific question, which is the subject has gotten broader. Because you talked about the national debt and concerns about that and the growth of government. And then you also mentioned about the idea of needing more public-private partnerships. Can you give me an example of public-private partnership that has worked or is working?
Well, I think the public-private partnerships that worked back in the 80s, I can talk about those in wastewater treatment. I served on the Environmental Finance Advisory Board of US EPA, and there was actually quite a few that worked in the water treatment area, that worked with wastewater treatment, that worked with state water authorities and working with the private sector. But I think there's a lot of areas in Ohio, I mean, where Aqua Ohio and others, you have a private water company that's basically providing the water supply. But I think there's a lot of good evidence there. I think where we need to work harder is in the education arena and also in healthcare, which are two areas of the American dream. My focus right now is on economic development and public-private partnerships there. There's a lot of evidence there that by the public and private sector working together, you can get a common agenda for a city, county, region, and state, and can work together. So I think a lot of those kinds of organizations have worked quite well. A lot of the public-private partnerships that serve downtowns, although more of those are being privatized. But there's been a lot of innovations there. I mean, just the finance districts have been set up and things. A lot of that, I think, has been good. I don't think we're really working at it right now, Jay.
That's my sense, is that's what's going on.
That's not what's going on. And that's what I'm trying to get people to think more about. I mean, as opposed to thinking, all right, let's just deregulate business and hope that they do the right thing. Let's really look at how, you know, we can energize new kinds of relationships between the public and private sector. When I talk about the private sector, I include philanthropy and I include the not-for-profit, private not-for-profit sector. But I think there's a need to redefine roles along the continuum. If it's healthcare, it's environment, you know. I don't think there's a lot of energy that's going on in that. I think there's a lot of great stuff around impact-oriented investment through philanthropies and things. There's a lot of good stuff there. But we're not really working very hard, just as we're not working very hard on intergovernmental relationships. It's just kind of a free-for-all. I think there's some places around the country that could lean more in that direction. And I think Atlanta is a good place for that. I spent some time really looking at their situation. That I think there's some interest there. But I look at other places and there's no interest in that. It's either the public sector does it or the private sector does it or it doesn't get done. But I think it would help a lot just in terms of efficiency. But that begs the whole question, what kind of economy do we really have? You know, people say it's strictly a market, it's a capitalist economy. You know, some people say, well, I don't even know, it's kind of a hybrid economy. And some people say, well, actually, we're engaged in socialism. And I've heard all this, really. It's just, you know, all along the spectrum. But I think we're more in a hybrid space, which suggests that public-private partnerships would make a lot more difference. But that, too, depends on who becomes president, right?
Do you think a lot of the division in the country is caused by the conservative and liberal broadcasters who try to inflict their own opinion and
Yeah, I think, well, you know, the slide that's up there kind of says what I was hearing in that regard. You know, that, you know, I think it contributes to it. I don't think we should ever decide that we suddenly don't need media and journalists, even though journalists are struggling, right? You all become freelancers. But it's such an important profession and calling. But when you look at, you know, what happens, the amount of money that goes into this, I mean, these folks at CNN, Fox News, they don't really want to end all these big ads and everything because they're benefiting by it economically. I have some friends in Canada, including my book marketing coach, Chris Brandt, who's in Vancouver. And he says, Don, he says, you know, we watch what's going on down here
and we tremble. He said, but I don't understand why you guys drag out the political process so long. He says, get it over, you know, what are you doing? He says, but, oh, we understand that. This is about how you drive your economy, isn't it? And he's right. But, you know, it's, so everything, I think, has to kind of, if we're going to change, they have to change in relation to each other, as opposed to saying, we're just going to improve government without making changes on the private side of the equation. But I hope we never reach the day where people don't have freedom of speech. I can't write a book the way I want to write it. I hope we never get to the day we're not allowed to do that.
So what do you think about taking books away from people in schools?
I think we should start a philanthropy that gives them back. I don't know, you know. My favorite place as a kid was the Martinsbury Public Library. And I went down there, Mary and I went down, was it in June? And I did a talk about writing. And ideally, I wanted to get teachers and students to come in, but you know, the school was out, so there's no way you're going to get them back. But that was my favorite place to go. And that's actually where I learned about poetry. From my father, I used to write poetry, and I learned it from him. But I would read poetry in the Martinsbury Public Library. We didn't have any poetry books at home, but libraries are incredibly powerful. But I hope we never reach that day where we go back and say, Catcher in the Rye, nobody can read it anymore. I hope not. You've been a great audience. Thank you so much for coming. Anybody who's interested in a signed book, it's yours. And to keep the conversation going, I would more than welcome if you, as you leave, to give me your email address. I know some of you I have, but...
Put it back at the table.
Pardon me?
Put it back at the table.
Yeah. And we could probably turn this off.